I had ridden for the spur the better part of 40 years, and I will tell you the truest thing I ever saw on that range had nothing to do with cattle. It had to do with a woman who walked out of a flood leading a half-drowned mare, and a horse no man among us could touch. And the day those two things came together and cracked Garrett Ames open like a walnut under a boot heel. I was young then, 19, maybe 20, all elbows and bad opinions, and I thought I knew horses because I had not yet met one that wanted me dead. The spur changed that for me. It sat under the sweetgrass rim where Caldwater Valley narrows down toward the Smoke River, good grass and bad weather, and a brand that meant something for 60 miles in any direction, and the man who owned it had a face like the rim itself, gray, set, and not given to changing for anybody's comfort. Garrett Ames. He had buried a wife 4 years before I signed on and a child with her, the same week, the same fever, and he had buried his own voice somewhere alongside them. He still gave orders. He still rode out before light and came in after dark and knew every head of stock by the look of its hindquarters in the dusk. But he had stopped talking the way a living man talks. He spoke in the fewest words the work would allow, and he never once, in all the time I knew him before that spring, said a thing that wasn't a thing that had to be said. I tell you this so you understand the size of what happened. You have to know how hard the ground was to know what it meant when something grew in it. The spring I am telling about came in mean. The snow up on the sweetgrass had stacked deep all winter, and then a warm rain came and sat on it for 3 days, and the Smoke River, which was usually a brown ribbon you could ford in July without wetting your stirrups, came up over its banks the color of churned coffee and twice as angry. We lost a stretch of bottom fence in a night. We lost a yearling that got herself trapped against the wire when the water rose, and Garrett went into the waist to cut her loose and got her out and never said a word about it, just stood there afterward dripping and looking at the river like it had insulted him personally. It was the morning after that the woman came. I was the one who saw her first, which I have dined out on for 40 years, so let me tell it right. I had ridden down to the bottoms to see how much fence the water had taken, and the river was still up, still roaring, brown and full of whole trees turning over slow in the current like the river was thinking about something. And on the far bank where the Graywater people had their country up the smoke, there was a figure coming down the bluff, coming down toward the water, leading a horse. I sat my pony and watched because there wasn't a sane reason on God's earth for anybody to come down to that river that morning. A man would drown, a horse would drown, and the figure came down anyway, slow and certain, picking the way, and I saw it was a woman, and I saw the horse she led was hurt, favoring a foreleg bad head low, a buckskin mare gone gaunt and dull. She got to the water's edge and she stopped, and I thought good she has sense after all. And then she didn't turn back. She studied the river the way Garrett studied his stock, like she was reading something written on it that I couldn't see, and she walked upstream away and stopped again and walked back, and then she led that broke-down mare into the Smoke River at the one place I learned later, where a gravel bar ran under the flood at an angle, the only footing in a half-mile, a thing you could not have known unless you had stood on that bank 100 times before in every season, and learned the river by heart. She came across at an angle, leaning into the current, the water up to the mare's belly and then her own waist, the mare staggering and her hand on its neck the whole way, talking. I could see her mouth moving though I could not hear a word over the river. And she brought that animal up out of the flood on the spur side of the Smoke River and stood there a moment, soaked through and shaking, and then she looked up the slope and saw me sitting my horse with my mouth open, and she did not look afraid. That was the first thing about Wheeler I ever knew. She had just walked through a flood that would have killed a strong man, leading a dying horse, and she came up the bank and saw a stranger watching, and she was not afraid. She was tired. She was wet to the bone, but she stood straight and she met my eye, and she waited to see what I was, the way you'd wait to see what a strange dog was before you decided anything about it. "Ma'am," I said, which was foolish, but I was 19. She didn't answer that. She looked at the mare, and then she looked at me, and she said, in English as plain as my own, This animal needs a dry place and a still place, and it needs them now. Her voice was low and even, and it had the quality Garrett's used to have before he lost it, the sound of a person who does not waste words because words are worth something. "There's a barn," I said, "up at the home place, Mr. Ames's place." Something passed over her face when I said the name, not fear, a kind of weighing. "Ames," she said. "You know him." "I know of the spur," she said, which was not the same thing, and she did not explain it, and she gathered the lead rope and looked up the long slope toward the home place as if measuring whether the mare would make it, and I understood I had just been enlisted, and I got down off my pony to walk beside her because it felt wrong to ride while she walked. That walk up from the bottoms took the best part of an hour, slow as we went for the mare's sake, and I learned in that hour the shape of the thing she was carrying, though not the whole of it. The mare was hers, had been hers since it was a foal, I gathered, though she didn't put it in those words. It had torn itself up bad coming down out of the high country, where she had been, where there had been some trouble I did not understand and did not pry into, and she had been bringing it home to her people upriver when the flood cut her off, and she had judged, rightly, as it turned out, that the animal would die before the water dropped, and so she had crossed to the only land within reach, which was spur land, which she had reasons to be wary of, and she had crossed anyway because the mare came first. I want to stop here and say a thing plain, because the valley got it wrong for a long while, and I will not pass the wrongness along. There was talk later, after she had been at the spur a while, that Garrett Ames had taken an astray, that he had done a Christian kindness to a poor lost Indian woman, that he had sheltered her out of the goodness of a hard heart. And every word of that is a lie, and it is the kind of lie that does its damage by making itself sound like praise. Wheela was not astray, and she was not lost, and she was not poor in any way that counted, and the goodness in the beginning ran the other direction entirely. She came onto that ranch carrying more than any of us, and she gave more than any of us, and the kindness, the first kindness, the one that started it all was hers. She could have let the mare die and saved herself the crossing. She didn't. That was the woman, right there at the start, before any of us knew her name. We came up over the last rise and the home place spread out below, the long low house Garrett had built for the wife who didn't live in it anymore, the barns, the big round corral by the horse barn, the bunkhouse where I slept, the cook shack with smoke coming off it. And down in the corral, throwing himself against the rails so the whole structure shuddered, was the reason the spur had been a place of bad temper and broken men all that spring. The Stallion. I had better tell you about the Stallion, because he is half the story, and because he was the thing that let Wheela show the valley who she was before the valley would have listened to a word she said. Garrett had bought a band of wild horses off a mustanger the autumn before, bought them cheap, because the mustanger was scared of them and wanted them gone. There were a dozen mares and young stock that gentled out fine over the winter, and there was the Stallion, a blood bay, near black in the winter coat, 16 hands and built like a thunderstorm, and there was something wrong in him that no amount of work had touched. Not wrong like sickness, wrong like a wound nobody could find. We had tried to break him the way we broke everything, which is to say, we tried to break him. That's the word we used and the thing we meant. You roped them and you choked them down and you sacked them out and you got a saddle on and a man up and you rode the fight out of them. And most horses, that taught them the man was the bigger animal and they made their peace with it. The Stallion did not make peace. The Stallion learned that men were a thing that came with ropes and pain, and he decided, somewhere in that hard, bright head of his, that he would die before he let it happen again, and that he would take a man with him if he could. He put Del Prude in his bed for a month with a busted hip. He caught old Tomaz across the shoulder with a forefoot and tore it to the bone. By that spring, there was not a man on the spur who would go into the round corral with him, and Garrett would not sell him and would not shoot him, and nobody could say why. And the Stallion stood in that corral day after day, getting meaner and lonelier and more dangerous, a standing argument that the spur had finally met a thing it could not master. Garrett came out of the horse barn as we came down the slope. He saw me first, and then he saw the woman and the broke-down mare, and he stopped where he stood and his face did the thing it did, which was nothing, it shut, like a door easing closed. "And," he said. "Cross the river," I said, which explained nothing. "Down at the bottoms. The mare's hurt bad," I told her the barn. "You crossed the smoke this morning," Garrett said to the woman. Not a question. He was looking at the mare's legs, at the water still draining off both of them, and you could see him doing the arithmetic of what that crossing meant and not believing it. "At the gravel bar," Wheeler said, "below the second bluff." Garrett's eyes came up to her face then and stayed. He knew that bar. Of course he knew it. He had likely crossed it himself in low water 100 times and never once thought a soul outside his own outfit knew it was there. "That bar's 6 foot under today," he said. "4," she said, "and it holds if you know where it runs." There was a silence then that I did not have the years to understand at the time. I understand it now. Garrett Ames had just been told by a woman he'd never seen who'd walked out of the river leading a dying horse that she knew his country better than he did. And a smaller man, a man more frightened of his own smallness, would have hated her for it on the spot. Garrett didn't. I watched it happen and I will swear to it. Something in that shut face moved, the way a thing moves under ice. He did not soften. He was 4 years past softening, but he looked at her the way he looked at whether he respected. "Barn's dry," he said. "Far stall, straws clean." And he turned and walked back into the horse barn, and that was the welcome, and from Garrett Ames it was a flood of warmth. We got the mare into the far stall and Wheeler went to work on her, and I stood in the aisle like a fool and watched, and what I watched I had never seen. She did not fight the mare. That sounds like nothing. It was everything. Every horse doctor I'd ever seen worked a hurt animal by overpowering it, tying it, twitching it, throwing it down so it couldn't move while you did what had to be done. And the animal learned that being doctored was a thing that happened to it, the same as being broke. Wheeler stood at the mare's shoulder and put her hand flat on its neck and she was still. She breathed slow and let the mare smell the fear go out of her, and she waited, and the mare's head came down by inches. And only when the animal had decided of its own self to trust her did she move down the leg to the torn place. And even then she narrated it, low, steady, a stream of quiet words half in English and half in her own tongue. And the words did not matter. I came to understand. The words were just the river the animal could float its fear down. She cleaned the wound and she made a poultice out of things she carried in a pouch at her waist, dried things. A smell like crushed green and something sharp, and she bound it, and the mare stood for all of it and never once tried to kill her. "Where'd you learn that?" I said when she was done. She looked at me with those level eyes. "Where did you learn yours?" she said. "Roping and riding," I said, "from the men here." "And before the men here?" "My pa, I guess." "So," she said, and that was the whole answer, and it took me about 10 years to understand it. She learned the way I learned. From her people, from those who came before, from a knowledge handed down hand to hand for longer than the spur had a name or the valley had a fence in it. I had thought of what she did as a gift, a strange woman's strange magic. It was not magic. It was a craft, older and better than mine. And the only magic in it was that she had bothered to learn the thing the rest of us were too proud to learn, that you cannot force a frightened creature to trust you. You can only become a thing worth trusting and wait. She stayed the night in the barn with her mare. Garrett had Cookie send a plate out, which Garrett did for no one, and in the morning when I came to Muck's stalls she was already up, and she was standing at the rails of the round corral, watching the stallion. The stallion was watching her back. I want you to understand what that meant. The stallion did not watch people. People were ropes and pain. He watched them the way you watch a snake, ready to strike or flee. But that morning he stood in the center of the corral with his head up and his ears forward and his eyes on the woman at the rail, and he was not afraid and he was not angry. He was curious. I had not seen curiosity in that horse in all the months I'd known him. I had not, I think, ever seen it. Garrett came out and stood a way off, watching the both of them. "That one's spoken for," he said. "By the boneyard. He's killed 2 men's careers and he'll kill the next." "He hasn't killed anyone," Wheeler said, without turning around. "He's tried." "No," she said it gently, the way you correct a child you don't want to shame. "If he'd tried, they'd be dead. He warned them. They didn't listen, so he made the warning bigger. He's been making it bigger all spring because no one will hear the small one." She turned her head then and looked at Garrett. "He's not a killer. He's a horse no one will let finish a sentence." I have thought about that line for 40 years. A horse no one will let finish a sentence. She might have been talking about the stallion. She might, I came to think later, have been talking about the man she said it to. Garrett didn't answer. He looked at the stallion and the stallion flicked an ear at him, all contempt, and Garrett's jaw worked once. "You think you can do something with him," he said. It wasn't quite a question and it wasn't quite a challenge. "I think I can listen to him," Wheeler said. "Whether anything comes of it is up to him, not me. That's the part your men keep getting wrong. You can't decide for a horse that he'll trust you. You can only make yourself safe to trust and then it's his to give." She paused. "I'd want it understood that I work alone in there. No ropes on the rail. No men with quirts standing by to help. If I'm in the corral, I'm in it by myself, and what happens is between him and me. He'll hurt you. That's mine to risk." And there it was again, the thing the valley would later turn into a story about a poor woman taken in. She was not asking Garrett to protect her. She was telling him to get out of her way. She set the terms. She named the conditions. She claimed the risk as her own and refused to let any man stand between her and it. From the first hour she was on that ranch, she was nobody's stray and nobody's charity. She was a craftsman declining to let amateurs touch her work. Garrett looked at her a long moment. Then he did a thing I'd not seen him do since the fever took his family. He gave way. "Corral's yours," he said. "I'll see the boys keep clear." And he meant it and he made it stick, which on the spur meant a great deal because the boys did not want to keep clear. They wanted to see the strange woman get herself killed so the order of the world would be restored, and Garrett stood on the lesson hard. Anybody so much as leaned on the corral rail to gawk, Garrett put him on the far fence line for a week. Word got around. The corral became Wheeler's ground, fenced off not by the rails but by Garrett Ames's flat refusal to let anybody trespass on it. It took her 11 days to put a hand on the stallion. I know because I counted, and because by about the 4th day the whole outfit was counting, pretending they weren't. She'd go in at first light and she would not chase him and she would not rope him and she would, near as I could tell, do almost nothing. She'd walk to the center of the corral and stand, and the stallion would run the rail, furious, waiting for the rope that didn't come, the pain that didn't come, and she'd let him run until he was tired of running at a thing that wasn't attacking him, and then she'd turn her back on him, turn her back, on a horse that had crippled 2 men and walk away, and leave him standing there with all his fight and nothing to fight. A horse is a herd animal. It cannot bear to be alone. The stallion had been made alone by every man who'd ever tried to master him, penned and isolated and hurt, and the one thing his whole body wanted was to belong to something, and here was a creature in his corral who was calm, who was unafraid, who did not hurt him and who kept walking away. By the 7th day he was following her to the rail. By the 9th he was standing closer to her than to the gate. On the 11th day she stood in the center of the corral with her back half turned and her hand low at her side, and the stallion walked up behind her on his own 4 feet and put his nose against her open palm, and the whole ranch, hidden behind whatever they were pretending to do, stopped breathing. She didn't grab him. She didn't whoop. She let him touch her hand and she let him take his nose away again, and she stood there, and after a while he came back and touched her again. And that was the 11th day, and that was the day the spur stopped being able to tell itself the story it had been telling. Garrett watched the whole of it from the horse barn door. When it was done he went back inside without a word, and I followed him in on some pretext, and I found him standing in the dim with his hand on a stall partition, not doing anything, just standing, and his face was not shut. For just that moment, with no one supposed to see, his face was open, and what was in it was something close to grief, which made no sense to me then. I understand it now. He was watching a creature he had given up as too broken to save get saved by patience and kindness, and he was a creature he had given up as too broken to save. And somewhere in him, a terrible hope had cracked the ice. The hope that maybe broken was not the same as finished, and hope hurt him worse than despair ever had, because despair asks nothing of you and hope asks everything. He saw me, the door eased shut over his face. "Get the team hitched," he said. "Fence won't mend itself." And I went because there was nothing else to do, but I had seen it, and I never forgot. She meant to leave, of course. That is the part people forget when they tell it soft. Wheela never came to the spur to stay. She came across a flood to save a mare's life, and she stayed while the mare healed, and she would have gone home up the smoke to her people the day the mare was sound, would have, if the valley had let her. The valley did not let her. It started in Ledger Falls, the town that sat where the Caldwater Road crossed the smoke, a dusty handful of buildings that thought a great deal of itself. Word had gone down from the spur, words travel, that Garrett Ames had a Greywater woman living in his horse barn, and that she gentled the killer Stallion. And the town took these two facts and made of them exactly the ugly thing you would expect a frightened, small-minded town to make. I was in Ledger Falls the day it came to a head, having ridden in for nails and coffee, and I will tell you who started it, because his name matters to the rest of this. Royal Catlin. He ran the bar C up the valley from us, the biggest outfit after the spur, and he had wanted to be the biggest outfit before the spur for 20 years and never managed it. And a man like that carries his failure around as a grievance and looks for somewhere to set it down. He set it down on Wheela. He was on the mercantile porch holding forth when I came up, and he had an audience, and he was saying the things such men say, that Ames had lost his judgment, that you couldn't trust those people, that the woman had likely witched the horse the same as she'd witched Ames, that the Greywater band were thieves and the valley wanted watching, and that a white man taking up with one of them was a disgrace that dragged the whole country down. He said worse than that. I won't carry the worst of it forward. It was the kind of talk that makes a young man's hands curl up, and mine curled. "You ride for Ames," Catlin said, seeing me. "That right, you see this woman." "I see her every day," I said. And I was 19 and afraid of him, and I had a chance to say something true and I almost didn't. And then I thought of the 11th day, the stallion's nose in her open palm, and I found I could not let the lie stand. "She gentled a horse 12 grown men couldn't touch," I said, "by being kinder and smarter than the 12 of them put together. That's what I see, Mr. Catlin. I see the best hand with a horse I ever watched, and a woman who walked through a flood to save an animal's life. And I'll tell you something else for free. I never once heard her say an unkind word about anybody, which is more than I can say for this porch." It got quiet. Catlin looked at me the way a big man looks at a thing he's deciding whether to bother stepping on, and I thought I'd bought myself a beating, and I might have, except that the mercantile door opened and Garrett Ames came out with a sack of flour on his shoulder. He had heard I don't know how much, enough. He set the flour in the wagon bed, unhurried, and he turned around and he looked at Royal Catlin, and the porch got quieter still, because Garrett Ames did not raise his voice and did not make threats and was, for exactly that reason, the most frightening man in Caldwater Valley when he chose to be. "Catlin," he said, "you've got opinions about my outfit. I've got opinions about what's good for this valley, Ames, and I'm not the only." "The woman you're talking about," Garrett said, as if Catlin hadn't spoken, "crossed the smoke at flood to save a horse's life. She's mended 2 of my animals that I'd have lost and gentled one I'd given up for dead. She's never asked me for a thing, never taken a thing, and never been anything in my sight but capable and decent." He paused. "Now, you can have your opinions. This is a free country and you're proof a man can hold any fool notion he likes. But you'll hold them off my land and out of my hearing, And if I learn you've moved from talk to anything else, if so much as a gate gets left open on the Greywater Road and I find your hand in it, you and I are going to settle it personal. Do we understand each other?" Catlin's face went the color of a brick, but he didn't push it, because there was something in Garrett's voice that even a man as full of himself as Royal Catlin could hear, and the porch had heard it too, and the moment broke apart the way moments do. Garrett climbed up on the wagon. "Get in, end," he said. And I got in, and we rode out of Ledger Falls in a silence, and we were a mile down the Caldwater Road before he spoke again, and what he said surprised me. "You stood up for her," he said, looking at the road. "Yes, sir." "Before I came out?" "Yes, sir." He drove a while. "Good," he said, "that was all." But coming from Garrett Ames, it was a medal, and I sat up straighter the rest of the way home, and I understood dimly, the way you understand things at 19, that something had shifted, that the question of the Greywater woman had stopped being a question of charity or curiosity and become, for Garrett, a question of what was right, and that Garrett Ames would burn his own ranch to the ground before he'd let what was right be trampled by the likes of Royal Catlin. What I did not understand yet, what none of us did, least of all Garrett himself, was why it had come to matter to him so much. He would have told you it was justice, and it was justice. But it was not only justice, and the part that wasn't justice was the part he'd buried 4 years deep, and it was going to take a fire and a flood to dig it up. Not because Garrett asked her to stay, he would not have known how to ask, and she would not have stayed on the strength of being asked. She stayed because the work asked her, which is a different thing, and a thing Garrett could understand. The stallion was gentle to her hand but not to anyone else's, and a horse that trusts one person and no other is only half a horse, and she would not leave a job half done. So she stayed to finish him, and then there was a mare foaling wrong, and then there was Tamaz's torn shoulder that had healed bad and tight, and she had things in her pouch for that too, and the staying built itself out of 100 small necessities, the way a stone wall builds itself out of stones, until one morning we all looked up and the Greywater woman had been at the spur 6 weeks, and nobody could remember deciding she should be. She did not live in the house. I want that clear, because the valley made filth of it and the truth was clean. She slept in the tack room off the horse barn, which she swept out and made her own, and she took her meals at the cook shack with the rest of us, and she earned her keep 10 times over and would not have taken keep she hadn't earned. Garrett offered her wages once, awkward as a boy, holding out coin, and she looked at the coin and then at him and said, "Is the mare mine?" Meaning her own buckskin, and he said yes, and she said, "Then I've taken my wages already. You sheltered her, we're square." And she would not take the coin, and Garrett put it away, and I think it shamed him a little, and I think it was good for him to be shamed, because he had spent 4 years believing that everything between people was a transaction, a thing owed and a thing paid, and here was a woman teaching him by plain example that the best things people do for each other can't be squared at all, and aren't meant to be. I watched them learn each other across that summer, slow, the way she gentled the stallion. Neither one of them was built for talk, but there is a kind of talking that isn't words, and they were both fluent in it. He'd come to the corral in the evening when the work was done and stand at the rail and watch her work the stallion in the long gold light, and she'd let him watch, which she let no one else do, and sometimes she'd say a thing about what she was doing and sometimes she wouldn't, and he'd grunt or he wouldn't, and an hour would go by like that, 2 people and a horse and the light going down, and not 40 words spoken, and it was, I see it now, it was courting. It was the only courting either of them had it in them to do. She was teaching him to read a horse the way she read it, the small signs, the ear and the eye and the set of the weight, and he was learning, and a man does not let himself be taught by someone he does not, at the bottom of himself, honor. And she was learning him too. She watched how he was with the stock, the gruff hands and the buried gentleness, the way he'd stand a long time at the grave of a horse that had served him, the way he could not say a soft thing but could not stop himself from doing one. She watched him put a fool cowhand on the far fence for a week for leaning on her corral, protecting her ground without ever once suggesting she needed protecting. And one evening she said to me, while she was rubbing down the stallion and I was forking hay, she said, "Your Mr. Ames is a man who lost something." "His wife," I said, "and a little one, the fever 4 years back." She was quiet a while, the brush moving. "I thought so," she said. "He keeps a part of himself the way you keep a hurt leg off the ground, so nothing can land on it." She looked at me. "It heals wrong, kept like that, a leg or a heart. It heals stiff and it pains a man the rest of his life, and he calls the pain his nature and stops trying to mend it." She went back to the brushing. "Somebody ought to tell him." "You tell him," I said, bold. She almost smiled. It was the closest I'd seen her come. "He'd have to ask," she said. "I don't go in where I'm not asked. Not with a horse, not with a man. That's the whole of what I know. End Stroud. You wait at the rail until they come to you. You make yourself a safe thing to come to, and then it's theirs to give or to keep." The brush stopped. "I can wait a long time," she said, quiet, more to the horse than to me. "I'm good at the waiting, but I won't go in uninvited, not for any man living." I have turned that over my whole life. She would not go in uninvited. She had more dignity than anyone I ever met before or since, and the shape of her dignity was this: she would offer, and she would wait, and she would never, ever force a door, not the Stallion's, not Garrett's, not the Valley's. She would only make herself a thing worth opening to, and leave the opening to the other. And the terrible patience of that, the strength it takes to want something and refuse to grab for it, to stand at the rail of a hard man's heart and wait to be asked in. I have known soldiers with less courage. The summer wore on and the rains that had drowned the spring dried up entirely, and by August the Smoke River was a thread and the grass on the Sweetgrass Rim went from green to gold to gray, and the word in Ledger Falls turned from the Graywater woman to the drought, which is the way of towns. They'll always trade one fear for a bigger one. It was the driest anybody could remember. The bottoms cracked. The high pastures burned brown. Garrett moved stock down to the river grass, and the river grass thinned, and he moved them again. And every rancher in the valley was doing the same, crowding stock down toward the shrinking water, tempers going as short as the grass. And then, the second week of September, with the whole valley dry as a tinderbox, and a hot wind coming down off the rim, the fire came. It started up on the Sweetgrass, lightning most likely, a dry storm that gave no rain and threw fire instead, and the hot wind took it and ran. I woke in the black of night to Tamaz shaking me and the red light already in the bunkhouse window, and I came out pulling my boots on, and the whole top of the world was burning. A line of fire a mile wide coming down the rim toward the valley, toward the river grass where every cow in Caldwater Valley was bunched, toward the spur. What I remember of that night is broken into pieces, the way such nights are. I remember Garrett in the red light, not shut-faced anymore but blazing, alive, throwing orders, and the men moving fast because for once there was a thing big enough to be worth all of us. I remember the horses screaming in the barn at the smell of it. And I remember that it was Wheeler who saw the thing none of the rest of us, all our lives in that country, had seen. We were going to lose the herd. That was plain. The fire was coming down faster than we could move 1,500 head of crazed cattle, and the river was too low and too narrow to stop it, and the men were already half arguing about cutting the fences and scattering the stock to save what we could, which would have meant a year's gather lost across 40 miles, and the spur broke by spring. And Wheeler came up out of the dark on the buckskin mare, bareback, her hair loose, and she found Garrett and she said one word. "Stone ground," she said. Garrett stared at her. "The old burn," she said, fast, urgent. "Above the second bluff, where the lightning fire ran 4 summers ago, there's no grass grown back yet, just rock and bare ground, a 1/4 mile of it across the whole neck of the valley. If you put the herd onto the stone ground and hold them, the fire comes down and finds nothing to burn and dies at the edge of it. It's the only ground in this valley that won't carry fire. But you have to move them now, and you have to move them up toward the fire, not away, and no cow on earth wants to run toward a fire, so you'll have to lead them, and they'll only follow one thing." "What thing?" Garrett said. "A horse that isn't afraid," she said. And there was only one horse in that valley that wasn't afraid of anything, because fear had been burned out of him long before this fire, and it was the killer Stallion, and there was only one person living he'd carry, and it was the woman saying all this, and Garrett understood it in the same half-second I did, and I watched him understand that the plan that would save the spur ran straight through the woman he'd been pretending all summer he didn't tremble for. "No," he said, "it came out of him before he could stop it. Not you, not up there." And Wheeler looked at him, and here is the moment, friends, here is the whole of it. She looked at him in the red light with the fire coming down, and she said, gently, the way she'd corrected him about the Stallion that first morning, she said, "It's mine to risk, Garrett. You don't get to keep me off the ground because keeping me safe is easier on your heart than losing me. I didn't ask you to carry that. Now get the men mounted and let me do the thing I know how to do." And Garrett Ames, who had buried his voice and his heart 4 years deep, who could not say a soft word to save his life, Garrett looked at her another half-second, and then he did the bravest thing I ever saw a man do, which was not on a horse and not against the fire. He stepped back. He let her go toward the danger because it was hers to go toward, because honoring her meant honoring her judgment and her risk and her skill, and he swallowed every protective word in him and he said, "Tell us where to push them." She told us, and we did it. I will not stretch out the next 2 hours. They were the longest of my life, and they would take a week to tell true. We cut the bottom fences, and we pushed 1,500 head of terrified cattle the wrong way, up the valley toward the wall of flame, and they did not want to go, and they would not have gone, except that out ahead of the whole crazed flood of them went a blood-bay stallion at a dead run with a woman on his bare back and her hand in his mane. And a horse running fearless toward a fire is such an unnatural and commanding thing that the herd, in the way of herds, followed the one creature among them that knew where it was going. She led them. She led 1,500 head onto the old burn, the quarter-mile of bare rock and ash where 4 years of drought had let nothing grow, and we hands worked the edges and held them bunched on the stone ground, and the fire came down the valley roaring like the end of the world, and met the bare ground, and found nothing to eat, and guttered and died. It died at the edge of the stone ground in a long line of falling flame, and the hot wind carried the last of it past us on either side where the river and the rock split it, and by the gray of dawn it was a smoking black ruin of a rim above us and not one cow lost. Not one. Wheeler sat the Stallion in the middle of the saved herd in the gray light, both of them black with ash, and the men, the same men who'd waited all spring for her to get herself killed, the men took off their hats. I saw it. 40 hard cowhands in the ash and the dawn, taking off their hats to a Greywater woman on a horse they'd called a killer, and not one of them, ever again in my hearing, called her anything but Miss Wheeler. Garrett rode up to her through the standing cattle. The two of them looked at each other a long moment in the ruined morning, and he didn't say a soft word. He never would learn to, not really, but he reached out and put his hand over her hand where it lay in the Stallion's mane, ash to ash, and he held it there, and she let him, and that was the most he had said to anybody in 4 years. You'd think that would be the end of it, the fire beaten, the valley saved, the hard man's hand on hers in the dawn. But the country wasn't done with them yet, and neither was Royal Catlin, and the last turn of this is the one that earned them everything, so let me tell it. The drought broke the way droughts do in that country, not gentle, but all at once, a week of rain so hard it seemed the sky meant to make up the whole dry summer in 7 days. And the Smoke River, which had been a thread, came up. It came up the way it had the spring before, brown and roaring, full of trees, and it came up faster, because the burned rim above couldn't hold a drop of it. The fire had stripped the sweetgrass bare, and every inch of that rain came straight off the rock and into the river, and the smoke rose higher and meaner than anyone in the valley had ever seen it. And the Greywater band was camped in the river bottom upstream. Wheeler knew it before any of us. She'd been reading the river all summer the way she read everything, and she came to Garrett white-faced and said her people were in the low ground above the second bluff, the winter camp, where they'd been since before there was a spur, and that the river was going to take that bottom by nightfall, and that there were old people in that camp and children, and that she had to go and there was no time and the gravel bar was 40 feet under and there was no crossing. And Royal Catlin's outfit had the only boat in the valley, a freight scow he used to move goods across in high water, big enough to carry people, tied up at the bar sea landing 4 miles down. I watched Garrett Ames do the arithmetic. The bar sea and the spur had been at each other's throats all summer. Catlin had spread filth about Wheeler across 3 counties. If Garrett rode to the bar sea and asked Royal Catlin for that boat, he'd be putting his pride and his outfit in the hands of the man who tried to ruin them, and Catlin would have every reason to laugh him off the porch, and the Greywater band, whom Catlin despised, would drown while 2 proud men settled scores. Garrett didn't hesitate. That's the thing I want you to know. The man who couldn't say a soft word, who'd squared every account his whole life, looked at the woman he loved and the people she came from, and he set his pride down in the mud and rode for the bar sea at a gallop, and I rode with him. I don't know what Garrett expected. I know what I expected: Catlin's contempt, an argument, precious time lost. And we came pounding into the bar sea yard in the rain, and Garrett came off his horse and Royal Catlin came out on his porch, and Garrett Ames, who had faced Catlin down in Ledger Falls without bending an inch, stood in that yard in the rain and said, "Royal, I need your boat and I need your men, and I'm asking. There's a camp of people upriver the smoke's going to take by dark. Old ones, children. I can't reach them without your scow. I've got no right to ask you anything, and I'm asking anyway. Help me get them out and I'll owe you whatever you name for the rest of my life." And the valley turned, right there in that rain. Because Royal Catlin was a small man and a mean one, but he was not, when you put it to him plain, with the lives of children in the balance and a proud man humbling himself in his own yard. He was not, at the bottom of him, a man who could stand there and let it happen. I watched it cost him something. I watched 20 years of grievance and meanness fight it out on his face with the plain human thing underneath. And the plain human thing won, barely, the way it does in most men if you reach it before the meanness sets too hard. "Get the scow," Catlin shouted at his hands, and to Garrett, gruff, not looking at him, "You don't owe me anything, get on your horse." And then lower, the nearest that kind of man comes to an apology, "I had her wrong, didn't I, the woman?" "You had her wrong," Garrett said. "Get on your horse," Catlin said again, and we did. What followed was the hardest night's work I ever did, and Wheeler was the center of it. It was she who knew the river, who stood in the bow of that scow in the dark and the rain, and read the current and called the line through the flood, the only one of us who could, threading that heavy boat across a killing river by a knowledge no white man in the valley possessed. We made the crossing 4 times. We took off the old ones first, then the children, then the rest, the Greywater people and the spur hands and the bar sea men, all working together in the black water with the river rising every minute, and Wheeler in the bow each time calling the line, and Garrett at the long sweep oar pulling where she said, the 2 of them moving that boat through the dark like one creature, and we got them out, every soul. The river took the camp an hour after we pulled the last child off the bank, took it whole, the lodges and the winter stores and the ground itself, gone under the brown flood. But it took no people, because a woman who would not be kept safe stood in the bow of a boat and led her people and 2 outfits worth of hard men through a flood by the strength of what she knew. When it was done, near dawn, soaked and spent, we stood on the high ground above the second bluff with the Greywater people around their saved old ones and children, and the elders of that band came to Garrett Ames. I won't pretend I understood all that passed. Some of it was in their tongue, and Wheeler stood between, turning it, but I understood the shape of it. The eldest among them, a man with a face like the canyon walls, spoke to Garrett a long while, and Wheeler turned it, and what it came to was this: that the Greywater people had watched the valley below them for longer than the valley had a name, and had learned to expect from it fences and grief, and that this man, this Ames, had set down his pride and come into the rain and asked for help to save their children, and had honored their daughter, had honored Wheela, by trusting her judgment and her risk where lesser men would have tried to lock her away from it. And that a man who would do those things had a place at their fire as long as he lived, and his outfit with him. And then the elder said the last thing, and Wheela went still turning it, and her voice changed, and I understood that this part was about her. The elder said she told it plain. She did not flinch from it, that Wheela was the band's healer, trained from a girl by the woman before her, that she had gone up into the high country that sprang on the band's business and was bringing word home when the flood first caught her, and that she had stayed in the valley these months by her own choice and no one's leave, as was her right, a woman grown and free. And that whatever she chose now, whether to come home to her people or to make her life in the valley below, was hers to choose, and the band would honor it. And any man who wished to share that life would answer to her judgment first and the band second, and to no one else ever, for she belonged to herself. Garrett listened to all of it, and when it was done, he did not answer the elder. He turned to Wheela, in front of her people and his men and the gray river and the risen sun. And he said the longest and the only soft speech I ever heard him make, and his weathered voice shook through the whole of it, and it went near enough like this. I'm no good at this. You know that better than anyone. I buried the part of me that could say a thing like this 4 years ago, and I made the burying my whole nature, and I'd have died like that, stiff and shut, and called it strength, if you hadn't come across that river and showed me the difference between a man who's strong and a man who's just stopped. You told in a hurt heart heals wrong if you keep it off the ground. You were right. Mine did. And I don't know how to mend it except to do the thing you taught the horse, to walk up slow and put my hand out and ask, and let it be yours to give or to keep. He took off his hat. Garrett Ames, in front of God in the valley, took off his hat to her. I'm asking, he said, not to keep you, not to shelter you. You've sheltered this whole valley and saved it twice, and you don't need a thing I've got. I'm asking because I'd rather spend whatever years I've got left standing at your rail, waiting for you to come to me, than spend them safe and shut and alone. You set the terms. You always have. Whatever they are, I'll meet them. But I had to ask because you don't go in uninvited. You told me that, and I won't either. So I'm at the rail, Wheela. And I'm asking you to let me in. And Wheela looked at him a long moment in the dawn, with her people behind her, and the saved children and the river that had given her back everything. And she did the thing she'd done with the Stallion on the 11th day. She didn't whoop, and she didn't fall into his arms like a girl in a cheap story. She crossed the ground between them on her own 2 feet of her own choosing, and she put her hand flat on his chest over the heart he'd kept off the ground 4 years, and she left it there, and she said, then mend it slow, and don't ever again decide what I'm allowed to risk. And he said, no, never again. And she said, then yes. And that was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it was more than most men get in a lifetime. They were married before the first snow, in a way that took account of both their peoples, the Reverend from Ledger Falls saying his words and the Greywater elders saying theirs. And the valley came, even Royal Catlin came, had in his hands, a changed enough man, and it was the strangest and the truest wedding Caldwater Valley ever saw. She did not stop being who she was. That's the part I love best. She did not become the rancher's quiet wife. She was the healer of the whole valley before 2 years were out, white and Greywater alike. The woman you sent for when a horse or a child or a grown man was hurt past what the Ledger Falls doctor could mend. And she kept her own name and her own knowledge and her own ground. And she went up the smoke to her people whenever she chose. And she never once, in all the years, went in anywhere uninvited or let any soul keep her from a risk that was hers to take. And Garrett, the ice went out of him slow, the way she said it would, and he never got loud and he never got easy with soft words, but he got open. And he laughed sometimes in the last years in a way I'd never heard the first years. And he and that blood-bay stallion came to an understanding at the last, the 2 hard creatures she gentled, and you'd see the 3 of them of an evening, the man and the woman and the horse, out at the corral in the gold light. and you would not have believed any of them had ever been broken at all. The stallion lived to be old, so did they. There were children, I'll not make a tale of them. They're old themselves now and entitled to their privacy. But I'll say that the spur in those years was full of young ones, Greywater and Valley both, and that the hardest man Caldwater ever made was, at the end of his life, the gentlest grandfather you ever saw, and that when folk asked him how it happened, how the spur's stone-hearted owner came to be the soft-spoken old man at the center of all that warmth, he'd say the same thing every time. He'd nod out toward the corral, toward the woman with the gray in her hair still working a young horse slow in the evening light, and he'd say, "She gentled me the same as she gentled him, walked up slow, waited at the rail till I came to her, never forced the door." And then he'd say the part that always put a catch in my old throat and puts one there now, telling it to you on this porch with the light going down. I spent 4 years thinking the kindest thing the world could do was leave me alone with my grief, Garrett would say. And then a woman crossed a flood to save a dying horse and showed me I had it backward. The kindest thing isn't being left alone. It's being waited for. It's somebody standing at the rail of your hard old heart, in no hurry, never grabbing, just there, until the day you find you can walk up on your own and put your nose in her open hand. He's gone now, these many years, and she not long after him, the two of them up on the rise above the spur where you can see the Smoke River run. I'm the last one left who saw it from the start, who stood on the bank that first morning and watched a soaked and unafraid woman come up out of a flood leading a half-dead mare, not knowing I was watching the best thing that ever happened to that valley walk up the hill toward a man who didn't yet know he was waiting for her. That's the truest thing I ever saw on that range. It had nothing to do with cattle. It had to do with the patience it takes to gentle a frightened creature, a horse, a hard man, a whole suspicious valley, and the kind of strength, the rarest kind, that wants something with its whole heart and still will not force the door. She had that strength. She walked up slow, and she waited at the rail, and she never once went in uninvited. I should have told you about her sooner because she mattered, but I didn't understand she mattered until Wheeler did. She was a gray mare named Dove, gone old and stiff, turned out in the far pasture where the retired stock lived out their days, and in 3 years on the spur I'd never once seen Garrett go near her. The other old horses he'd visit, he'd stand a long while at the graves of the ones that died. I told you that, but Dove, alive, he rode past like she was a fence post. I'd asked Tamaz about her once early on, and Tamaz had looked at me a certain way and said, "That was the missus's saddle horse," and said no more, and I'd had the sense not to ask again. Wheeler found Dove the way she found everything, by paying attention. She was out walking the far pasture one evening. She walked the whole ranch, learned every animal on it the way she'd learned the river, and she came on the old gray standing alone at the fence corner, head low, and she stopped, and she watched her a while, and the next morning she said to me, "The gray in the far corner, she's grieving." "Horses don't grieve," I said, 19 and certain. Wheeler looked at me with that patience that never had any scold in it, only a kind of sorrow that I'd been taught so poorly. "Everything that loves grieves," she said. "You only think they don't because you've decided not to watch. That mare had a person. The person's gone, and she's been left in a far corner to be old by herself, and no one's been near her in," she paused, reading it off the animal somehow, "years. Whose was she?" I told her, the wife's saddle horse, the one Garrett rode past. Wheeler was quiet a long moment. "He can't look at her," she said, "because looking at her is looking at the wound. So he keeps her off the ground the same as he keeps his own heart off the ground, and the mare's paying for it. She didn't do anything but love a woman who died, and she spent 4 years alone in a corner for the crime of reminding him." She gathered herself. "That's not right, end. A grief you won't tend turns cruel without your meaning it to. He'd be ashamed if he saw it. He's a decent man, he just can't look." I thought she'd leave it. It wasn't her place. It was the rawest thing on that ranch, the one door nobody knocked on. But she told me she didn't go in uninvited, and I learned that day exactly what she meant by it, because she didn't go in. She went to the rail and waited, the way she always did. She started bringing the old gray a handful of something each evening, standing with her, brushing the burrs out of a coat nobody touched in years, and she said nothing to Garrett about it. She just made herself and made the mare into a thing he might one day walk up to, and she let it be his to come to. It took most of a month. What finally did it was a small thing, the way the big things always turn on small ones. Dove came up lame one evening, just a stone bruise, nothing, and Wheeler was doctoring it in the last light. And Garrett came looking for me about some matter of the morning's work, and found the two of them instead. The Greywater woman crouched at the foreleg of his dead wife's horse, talking to her low in that river of quiet words. And he stopped. I was forking hay in the near barn, and I saw it through the door, and I held still the way you hold still near something that might bolt. Garrett stood there a long time. Wheeler knew he was there, she knew everything that was near her, but she didn't turn and she didn't stop and she didn't make it a moment. She just kept doctoring the mare, low and easy, and left the ground open and waited. And after a while Garrett walked up, slow, the way she'd taught the stallion. He came across that pasture to the horse he hadn't touched in 4 years, and he stopped a few feet off, and Wheeler moved over without a word to make room, still working, still talking that low stream, and Garrett Ames reached out one weathered hand and put it on the gray mare's neck. The mare turned her head and breathed at him. Knew him, 4 years, and she knew him. I had to look away. Some things a man oughtn't watch, even at 19, even from a hay barn, and the sight of that hard old rancher standing in the dusk with his hand on his dead wife's horse, and his shoulders gone at last from their long stiff set, was one of them. I don't know what Wheeler said to him, low, while it happened. I never asked and she never told. But when I looked back, Garrett had gone down on his heels beside her at the mare's leg, the two of them working together in the dark, and I heard him say, rusty, like a gate that hadn't moved in years, I heard him say a name. The wife's name. He said it out loud to the mare, to the woman, to the dusk. The first time Tamaz told me later that anyone had heard him say it since the fever. After that, Dove came up from the far corner. Garrett moved her to the near pasture by the house, and he visited her of an evening, and the cruelty Wheeler had named, the unmeant cruelty of a grief left to go bad, went out of the spur like a held breath let go. And I understood that Wheeler had healed something that had nothing to do with the horse at all, and had done it without once forcing the door. By the same craft she healed everything. She'd made herself safe to come to, and she'd waited, and she'd let the hardest man in the valley find his own way back to a name he'd buried. Royal Catlin did not take his Ledger Falls dressing down quietly, whatever I may have made it sound. A man like that doesn't change because a better man faced him on a porch. He just moves his meanness somewhere it won't get answered so direct. And across that summer it moved onto the Greywater Road and onto the band's stock in small ways that were hard to pin and easy to feel. A stretch of the band's horses came down sick in midsummer. A thing in the water, it turned out, where their stock watered along a draw below the Bar C range. Could have been nothing. Could have been the runoff from where Catlin's hands had been clearing brush with something poured on it to kill the roots. Nobody could prove it, and Wheeler was too careful to claim it. But she rode up and doctored those horses 3 days running, and she came back the third evening with her jaw set in a way I'd not seen. 2 of them I couldn't save, she said. She didn't say more than that for a while. Then, it wasn't sickness that started in those animals. It started in the water, and the water comes down off the Bar C. She looked at me. I won't say a man did it on purpose. I won't say what I can't see. But I'll say the water that killed those horses ran down from one man's land, and that one man has spent all summer telling 3 counties my people are thieves who want watching. She was quiet. It's a strange thing, how the men most afraid of being robbed are so often the ones doing the taking. She told Garrett. I expected him to ride for the Bar C with blood in his eye, and a younger Garrett might have, but Wheeler had taught him something across that summer about not forcing doors, and he heard her out, and then he said, "You're sure enough to grieve over it. You're not sure enough to hang it on him." "No," she admitted, "not sure enough to hang it on him." "Then we don't hang it on him," Garrett said. We fence the band stock off that draw and we run a pipe down from the clean spring on my land, and we take the water Catlin might have poisoned out of his reach entirely, and we never give him the satisfaction of an accusation he can deny." He paused. "And we let him watch us do it. Let him watch the spur run good water to the Greywater band across his own valley. That'll eat at a man like Catlin worse than any fight." And that's what they did. It took the better part of 2 weeks, the spur hands and the Greywater men working the line together. That was the first time the two outfits worked shoulder to shoulder, that water line, long before the fire and the flood made them do it for their lives. And when it was done, the band stock drank clean spring water off spur land, and there was nothing Royal Catlin could do about it but sit his porch and chew on it. I think now that the water line was the quiet hinge of the whole thing. It put the two peoples next to each other at honest work for the first time, hand to hand, so that when the fire came they already half knew each other. And when Garrett rode to the Bar C in the rain to beg a boat, some part of Catlin had already spent a summer watching the spur do the decent thing in plain sight, and it had worn his meanness thinner than he'd ever have admitted. There was one bad evening in the middle of it. A gate on the Greywater road got left open, the very thing Garrett had warned Catlin about in Ledger Falls, and a bunch of the band's horses got out onto the Bar C range, and for a day it looked like the spark that would set the whole valley to open war, Catlin roaring about Greywater stock on his grass, his hands talking ugly. And it was Wheeler who put it out. She rode onto the Bar C alone, against every man's advice because it was her people's stock and so her matter to mend, and she gathered those horses herself, quiet, in front of Catlin's whole jeering outfit, and she did not give them the fight they wanted. She gathered her people's horses and she turned at the gate and she said to Royal Catlin, loud enough for all his men to hear, "Your gate or mine, Mr. Catlin. A gate left open does its mischief just the same. I've shut this one. I'd be obliged if it stays shut." And she rode out, and she'd given him nothing to push against, no anger to feed on, and his own men were quiet, and I heard later that one of the Bar C hands said that evening, it was a hard thing to keep hatting people when the worst of them was a woman who shut your gates and thanked you for it. The meanness needs a fight to live on. She would never, ever give it one. That was a weapon Royal Catlin had no answer for, because he'd never in his life met it. I've made the gentling of the Stallion sound quicker than it was, those 11 days, and I've made the rest of his story, the fire run, the river, sound like the Stallion was simply ready by then, a tool to hand. It wasn't like that. The trust she built with that horse she built every single day, and it could break, and one day in high summer it nearly did, and what she did about it taught the whole outfit more than the gentling had. A new hand had signed on, a fellow named Briggs, all swagger, the kind who'd heard a woman was working the killer Stallion and decided he'd show the outfit how a real man did it. He went over the rail one noon when Wheeler was at the cook shack, went in with a rope, meaning to throw and ride the horse and have the laugh on her, and the Stallion did what the Stallion did to men with ropes. It was bad. We got Briggs out over the rails with a broke arm and a gash down his scalp, and he was lucky past his deserving that it was no worse, and the Stallion was back to what he'd been in the spring, wild-eyed and screaming and certain again that men were ropes and pain, all of it undone. 11 days and weeks of patience gone in 3 minutes of one fool's vanity. Wheeler came from the cook shack at the noise. She didn't run. She took it in, Briggs bleeding, the Stallion mad against the far rail, the men shouting, and her face for just a second showed the only true anger I ever saw on it. Not at the horse, at the man. "He came to me," she said, very low, looking at the horse betraying his old terror against the rails. 11 days and he came to me, and this fool taught him in 3 minutes that he was right to be afraid all along. She turned to Garrett. "Get him doctored," she said of Briggs, "and get him off this ranch, because I won't rebuild what I build only to have it torn down by men who think kindness is a thing women do, because they haven't the strength for a rope." Garrett ran Briggs off that day, and then he did a thing that told me how far he'd come. He didn't tell Wheeler it was all right, didn't tell her she could fix it, didn't offer a single empty comfort. He went and stood at the corral rail beside her, not in the corral, he knew better than to go in, and he stood his watch with her while she started over. Because she did start over. She went back in that evening to a horse who'd just been given every reason to hate the whole race of humans afresh. And she stood in the center of the corral, and she was still. And she let him run. And she turned her back and walked away. And she began again at the beginning, day 1 of 11, or 20, or however many it would take. It took 9 days the second time. Faster than the first, because somewhere under the fresh terror the horse remembered her, remembered that there had been one human in all the world who came without a rope, and the remembering shortened the road. On the 9th evening he walked up behind her and put his nose in her open hand. The second time, the rebuilt time. And this time when it happened, Garrett was at the rail and the whole outfit was watching openly, and not one of them pretending otherwise. And when the stallion touched her hand, the men didn't cheer. They'd learned better. They just stood there in the dusk and watched a broken thing get mended twice by the same patient hands. And I think every man on that ranch understood, that evening, that what they were watching was the strongest thing any of them had ever seen, and that it looked from the outside like the gentlest, and that they'd had the two confused their whole lives. He came back faster, I said to her after, wondering at it. Trust always comes back faster the second time, she said, rubbing the horse down in the near dark. If it's real, the first time they're learning whether you're safe. The second time they're only remembering. That's true of horses. The brush moved, slow and even. It's true of men too, and the hard part is never the second wound. It's the first trust. Get a creature to come to your open hand once, really come of his own choosing, and even if the world breaks it, even if some fool with a rope undoes it all, there's a memory in him now that wasn't there before. A memory that it's possible. And you can always, always build back to possible. She looked out at the dark valley, toward the sweetgrass rim, toward, I think now, the man up at the house with the dead wife's name new again in his mouth. That's the whole of what I know, she said again, the way she'd said it the first week. You make yourself a safe thing to come to, and you wait. And if it breaks, you make yourself safe again and you wait again, as long as it takes. There's no other way, and that lasts. Every other way is just a rope.